In this lesson, we're taking our first look at cells. Now, cells you may have seen before in a previous class, and perhaps the illustration looks something like this, what you see currently on the slide. Maybe a little bit cartoonish, not a lot of detail, maybe labeled some parts and some structures. We'll do that in this course and in this lesson, so you'll see those structures. But really, we want to start to see and connect to our biomolecules. What are the actual components? Where do those show up inside the cell? And what do we see as differences between different types of cells? So please realize that the illustrations we use are helpful and they're useful, but they don't always represent every structure like it would really look under a microscope. On this next slide, I've got some examples of what of what cells really look like. Here you go. Kind of weird, kind of different here, and not quite as much detail as perhaps you're seeing in the illustrations. In every cell, you can probably identify a nucleus, so that big sphere or ball in the center of each. Maybe you can see some of the cytoskeleton, all the little lines, microfilaments and microtubules, perhaps. But beyond that, you really don't see much as far as organelles. So just keep in mind there's a difference between what the real cells look like and what the illustrations show. Not every cell is going to show every organelle. So here we go. Let's look at cells. By way of reminder, we're in our first unit, and some terms you've already seen before are homeostasis and metabolism. Living things are going to process materials to get energy and the actual raw items that they need. So elements, different structures there, so we can build those biomolecules. So homeostasis and metabolism, cells are doing that. And let's remind ourselves what our component biomolecules are. Inside cells, we've got our biomolecules. We have things like our carbohydrates, so the carbs, and our lipids, and proteins, and amino acids. Look for these materials inside the cell. Where would you find them? What are they doing? If you see why we need these materials or where they show up in the cell, the purpose of these biomolecules becomes quite clear. So moving forward, let's go look and see where we can find these materials inside cells. Starting off, we need to realize that we have two main types of eukaryotic cells. We've got the animal cell, which you see over here on the left, and plant cells. A lot of similar structures, but a few things that are different. For instance, you've got this cell wall on the outside of the plant. Both of these have a cell membrane, which is what you kind of see on this inner side, inner structure. And then some other differences beyond there, which we'll show in just a moment. So animal cells and plant cells, let's have a look at what things may be similar or different there. One example of this similarity is that they both have this cell membrane. And remember, cell membranes, those are going to be made out of lipids. Specifically, we call it the phospholipid bilayer. But both of them are going to have this little outer covering made out of those lipids. The plants have an extra layer. This is the cell wall. Cell wall is made out of cellulose in plants, and that's going to be made out of our glucose monomers. So here's two of your biomolecules showing up. And what are they doing? They're the outside of the cell. They're providing that support and that structure on the outside. Both of them have cell membranes, but only the plants have that cell wall. Here's your terms for putting that down in your notes. All cells are going to have a cell membrane, but pretty much just the plants and then a few other things like bacteria and archaea that may have a cell wall. So the cell membrane is the phospholipid boundary surrounding all cells, and it is semi-permeable. Permeable has the idea that something can get through that boundary. So in that wall, there's going to be little openings, little holes or channels. Some of those just let anything through, some of them let a few things through, and some of them actively move things through. They're semi-permeable, they let things in and out of the cell. Cell wall is going to be a polysaccharide layer that protects cell membranes in some types of cells like we just mentioned, and so most particularly in plants. Looking inside the cells, we've got internal structure going on, and you can have a combination of things. You either have microtubules or you have microfilaments. Microtubules and microfilaments, they're both part of that internal structure, and they just kind of help hold the cell up. If you think of a cell kind of like a tent, if you've ever gone camping, you've had to put up a tent and you've got that all those pieces that you have to put together, all the little rods that you may have put together to hold up the tent, that's kind of like the microtubules and microfilaments. They're long, they're rigid, they give the cell its shape. They can also act like little train tracks. They have motor proteins that can move things along their length. They can also help provide that transport, so structure and transport inside the cell. Microtubules, which you'll find later, have some other roles. They tend to grow out from the center of the cell from these things called the centrosome. So that's an organelle where they kind of root down, where they root out from. That's kind of an origination point for those structures. More on those later, but just generally know microtubules, microfilaments, and the centrosome, those are structures related to the actual support of the cell and transport of stuff within it. You've heard me mention a couple times now the word organelle, which kind of sounds like organs in the body, and with the suffix "l" makes it diminutive. Small structures, complex structures with specialized functions inside the cell. A lot of what you see in this picture here, things like the nucleus, or the endoplasmic reticulum, or this Golgi body, all of those are different organelles that we cover in this lesson. It's helpful to know where they are and what they do, and if you can, figure out what they're made of. So let's go ahead and have a quick look at these organelles in our journey through cell structure. Everybody's favorite. It's the mitochondria, sometimes called the powerhouse of the cell. Mitochondria are in all eukaryotic cells, so you're going to find them in plant cells and animal cells, both. These are what process certain substances like glucose and use oxygen to turn them into energy-bearing compounds. We call that process cell respiration. So mitochondria, they're in all of the eukaryotic cells and they process glucose to make energy. Speaking of energy, ultimately glucose has to come from somewhere, and we have the plants to thank for that. Here's a diagram of a chloroplast. This is the green stuff inside plants. Chloroplasts are filled with an ingredient called chlorophyll, and they have specialized structures inside that capture sunlight energy to convert it into glucose. They take other materials, and glucose comes on out. Energy and sunlight, energy from sunlight going together to make glucose. More on that process later, but just keep in mind this is a specialized structure in plant cells, and this is what's actually capturing energy to make glucose, which the mitochondria can then use. On to the nucleus. The nucleus here, our control center. This is where you're going to find DNA getting stored. DNA. What was that biomolecule? That's nucleic acid. Nucleic acids are stored in here, at least the DNA is. So DNA, you're going to find it in the nucleus. Now, it's helpful when you're looking at organelles not to just know what they look like or what they're called, but kind of how they fit together and operate. Again, other lessons talk about this more, but here's your initial context for a few different structures that are nearby each other and what their relationship is to each other. Have a look on the next slide. We can call this the protein pathway. And in general, stuff is going to start here at the nucleus. The nucleus contains our DNA, and that DNA eventually gets translated. It gets translated into RNA that helps build these little items you see here. All these little squiggly shapes you might recognize as proteins. Proteins were our amino acids, and those later go to form all kinds of functions, chemical signaling, cell structure, many different roles that proteins have. And the instructions for making them are here in the nucleus, this big old purple thing, and they get built right next door inside this structure. We call this thing the endoplasmic reticulum. A lot of these details and how you spell them are on further slides, but this first one here is just giving you the context. The nucleus has the information. It sends it out to the endoplasmic reticulum, which has a bunch of ribosomes. Ribosomes are little structures inside this endoplasmic reticulum that build the proteins. Once the proteins are built, they get sent out. All of these little circles you see here, they are vessels, or rather vesicles, things that can help to transport proteins or anything else that needs to move around throughout the cell. Here they join the Golgi body, which helps to repackage and process those proteins. Sometimes it changes their shape, it folds them around, and gets them ready to operate. It can send them outside the cell, or it can send them back into the cell, transported through vesicles or directly into the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is just all this gel, all this space where there's not otherwise organelles inside the cell. Proteins are important. You're going to see them a lot. They start in the nucleus and they work their way outwards through the endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi body, and so forth. Let's have a look at the following slides where it actually kind of puts some of that information in writing with some other terms. Ribosomes can be found in the endoplasmic reticulum. On the previous slide, I showed you that was that stuff around the nucleus. Ribosomes are in the rough part of the endoplasmic reticulum. When you're looking at endoplasmic reticulum, you're going to find a couple different sections, one of which is smooth, don't really see any bumps on it, and then the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Rough ER has the ribosomes, which are the little machines, the little bumps on that reticulum that create proteins. Vesicles from the smooth ER transport it to the Golgi apparatus, which then sorts and packages the proteins. Let's park on the idea of vesicles for a moment. Vesicles are bags, and you've got a few different types of bags. You may be familiar when you go to the grocery store. Maybe you're going to use a plastic bag or a paper bag or a reusable bag. You got some type of bag. Maybe it's a insulated insulated bag for cold stuff or hot stuff. A few different types here. They all are made of the same stuff. They're actually made out of phospholipids, but our main vesicles, those are just any membrane-bound structures that store and move materials. So they're going to look like a little circle or something like that. Lysosomes are a vesicle that has some stuff inside it. If it's got different enzymes in it, it's almost going to act like a little stomach. If the cell has trapped some sort of food item or waste item and it needs to be broken down, lysosomes are going to go to work inside that vesicle and break it down. So kind of like a stomach or some other organ that can process materials, lysosomes are a specialized vesicle that'll break down that material. Now you can also have a much larger type of vesicle called a vacuole, which tends to hold or pump water. Cells, especially single-celled organisms that live in an aqueous or water environment, they do need to eventually control how much water they contain. Too much or too little water can really change how that cell holds on to things like salt. And if you have too much salt going on, well, that cell might die. So vacuoles, like you see in blue here on this illustration, in this plant cell, it's holding a bunch of water. And that helps to actually pressurize the cell, help it push out and fill out. If you've ever seen a house plant, it's just kind of like starting to droop over to the side. Chances are you haven't watered it in a while, and its cells have lost pressure. But once you water it, it can actually kind of stand up again because its cells have refilled with water. Those vacuoles have filled up, and it can once again kind of push itself upright. Vesicles are bags. They're any type of membrane-bound organelle that holds stuff. They may be holding food, they may be digesting or breaking down stuff, or they may simply be holding water. Almost done. One more slide here. We have focused on eukaryotes in this lesson, plant cells and animal cells, but there's one other type. Let's look. Generally speaking, we've got our eukaryotes, the plant cells and the animal cells. Here's our animal cell, here's our plant cell. You'll notice they have a lot of similar structures. They've both got a nucleus. They've both got endoplasmic reticulum. They've both got Golgi bodies. They both have mitochondria and many other things. The plants are specialized because they have our chloroplasts that you see in green. These both have cell membranes, and then the cell wall is special to our plants. Those are all features of our eukaryotes. But over next door, we've got the prokaryotes. Sorry, my video bubble's partly covering the illustration, but if you look at this thing here, it's got some things that the plant has. It's got cell membrane and it's got a cell wall on it, but it's got some other stuff. It's also got this flagella. And there is where a lot of the similarities stop. If you look inside, this thing is storing its DNA in a very different way. There's no nucleus down here. There's just the DNA hanging out there in the middle. No membrane around the sides. There's no mitochondria here. There's no chloroplasts. There's no vacuoles. This thing has no membrane-bound organelles. That's your main difference. We don't spend a whole lot of time on prokaryotes in this course, but just know that they are different, and they're going to include things like bacteria. If you ever wondered why antibiotics work, those are a type of medicine that is poison, but it's only poisonous to these guys, prokaryotes. It can kill prokaryotic cells, but not eukaryotic cells. Antibiotics work on a different type of cell. That's it for this lesson. That was just a quick overview there. You're going to see more about our cells through different activities in this unit.